Este ano, entre as novidades do painel Telebrasil, merece destaque a presença de grandes lideranças internacionais em nossa programação. Nos últimos dias, além de representantes do setor de telecomunicações, tivemos o privilégio de receber nomes como Maurício Clever Carone, presidente do BID, que esteve aqui hoje, inclusive, Margrethe Vestager, comissária da Agenda Digital da União Europeia, entre outros que navegaram pela dimensão estratégica da agenda digital. E mantendo esse compromisso, convido agora o diretor da OCDE, Andrew Wyckoff, para uma apresentação muito aguardada sobre os efeitos da conectividade no desenvolvimento econômico e social. Andrew, seja muito bem-vindo ao painel Telebrasil 2021. É um prazer tê-lo conosco esta manhã. É com você.
Good morning. My name is Andrew Wyckoff. I'm the Director of Science, Technology, and Innovation at the OECD, headquartered in Paris, France. It's my pleasure to join you today to participate in this conference, which comes at a very timely point as we continue to navigate COVID-19 and look at the challenges facing the telecom industry, including those facing in Brazil. I'm delighted to take part in this via virtual connections, and we've seen over the last 18 months just how important these virtual connections are, and they demonstrate the importance of reliable, high-quality broadband connectivity and its role in the digital transformation and injecting resilience in our economies and societies as we cope with the COVID-19 crisis. The OECD has developed the Going Digital Integrated Policy Framework, which identifies 7 policy dimensions that help countries set a whole-of-government approach to the digital transformation. Access to broadband is a key pillar, without which there is no digital transformation. Despite the digital transformation holds great promise for Brazil, and despite solid progress in the early 2000s, Brazil's economic growth engine has slowed. This occurred even before the COVID-19 crisis. Brazil urgently needs new drivers of growth, productivity, and societal well-being. We see the digital transformation policies playing a key role in achieving a new growth path. At the end of 2020, we launched 2 reports on this very same topic. The first was Going Digital in Brazil, and the second was an OECD Telecommunication and Broadcasting Review of Brazil 2020. It's my great honor today to briefly present the findings of the latter of these 2 reports in more detail, as it directly addresses the challenges Brazil faces to expand connectivity. The aim of the review was to analyze the performance of communication markets and to understand the underlying policy and regulatory frameworks. In other words, the status quo, what was going on in Brazil then, in order to set forth and give us a sound basis for devising recommendations for regulatory reform that are adapted to the convergent telecom environment. At the end of the day, the overall objective was to improve connectivity in Brazil, understood as access to high quality connections and communication services at affordable prices, as these are the backbone of the digital transformation. Just as a preamble, and as you well know, expanding connectivity in Brazil is clearly a multidimensional challenge. First, the geographical features of the country create difficulties in bridging rural digital divides. To put this in perspective, particularly the geographical dimension perspective, Brazil is approximately 8 times the size of France and Spain combined, and comprises more than 60% of the Amazon forest within its borders. It also has a complex institutional framework. In the communication and broadcasting sectors, there's a plethora of different service definitions and legacy regulation that exists. Brazil also has multiple layers of government, federal, state, and municipal, each of which plays its own role. While drafting the report, I should tell you reforms in the sector were underway and were passed in October of 2019 that affected the regulatory framework. Let me briefly set the scene by highlighting a few communication market developments. The use of mobile services has been a primary driver for increasing connectivity in Brazil. Mobile broadband subscriptions more than tripled between 2012 and 2019, passing from 59.2 million to 209.8 million different subscriptions. But gaps persist in the fixed broadband, especially compared to OECD countries. In June of 2019, fixed broadband penetration in Brazil reached about 16 subscribers per 100 inhabitants, which compares to an OECD average of 31. So you're significantly below the OECD benchmark. Disparities also persist in terms of availability and quality of broadband compared to OECD countries. But within Brazil, connectivity divides are not only about access to broadband, but also the quality of the connection. At the end of the day, you want people to be connected well. A key indicator for broadband quality is the connection speed. We depict different speed measures on this slide, which you can see that Brazil is well below the OECD average in terms of connection speeds. And according to our Lab data, the average fixed broadband download speed in Brazil was 4.8 megabytes per second in May of 2019, which compares to an OECD average of 26.8 megabytes per second. Pay TV and broadcasting markets are concentrated, but pay TV is beginning to lose subscribers. Let me point this out in two different facts. First is for pay TV, two players have 78.8% of the market, and for broadcasting, one broadcaster accounts for 51% of total free-to-air audience share. Meanwhile, data from Anatel shows that between 2014 and 2019, Brazilian pay TV lost over 3.8 million subscribers. However, new players such as over-the-top providers or OTTs are increasingly applying pressure in terms of new audiovisual content, offerings, and business models. Netflix is one example of this, but in the review we mentioned several commercial video on-demand services. Estimates for 2018 indicate the number of unique OTT subscriptions in Brazil was around 21.3 million users, a subscription base which has been constantly growing since 2011. The review also saw two key weaknesses in the communication institutional framework in Brazil. First was the overall tax burden in Brazil's communication sector is high compared to other countries. The second was in terms of policy and regulatory framework, a key witness is the lack of institutional design adapted to an increasingly convergent environment. In the communication and broadcasting sector is a plethora of different service definitions and legacy regulations that persist. There's a complex licensing regime that raises barrier to market entry and may lead to regulatory arbitrage. In addition, Brazil has multiple layers of government, federal, state, and municipal that increases the challenge to achieve a coherent and coordinated policy approach. The next slide provides an overview of selected recommendations in the report. In the time available, I can't elaborate on each of these and will only give a very abbreviated background for each. Rather, I suggest that you go to our website and pull down the full report and read it in detail. Based on its finding, the report recommends action in four key areas. The first, improving the policy and regulatory framework. The second, overhauling taxation, fees, and the tariff framework. Third, improving market conditions and fostering competition in communication and broadcasting markets. And fourth, strengthening national policies and evidence-based policy making. Let me briefly go through each of these. As convergence progresses, and with increased a bundling of communication services, the contours between communication and broadcasting sectors becomes blurred. As such, distinguishing operators by services becomes outdated. Therefore, the report recommends to adapt the institutional design to a convergent environment. In particular, Brazil should create a converged regulator where a single entity should assign spectrum for both broadcasting and communication services. We also recommend easing market entry with a single class licensing regime for communication and broadcasting services. Other OECD countries have done this registration type of licensing since the late 1990s or more than for 20 years. A single class license could help Brazil mitigate taxation and regulatory arbitrage by operators. We also recommend that you remove legal categorical restrictions on vertical integration of the pay TV value chain. The assessment of vertical mergers should be conducted on a case-by-case basis. Overall, Brazil should enhance coordination of policies and regulation at all levels of government. The high level and complexity of taxation in the communication sector in Brazil is what we consider to be an Achilles heel that may influence investment levels, both domestic and foreign. This places a high burden on one sector that could have many positive spillovers throughout the economy. We recommend that Brazil should harmonize its tax on communication services across states, the so-called ICMS, and reduce them where possible. In the long run, Brazil should pursue the efforts for a fundamental reform of the indirect tax framework to reduce distortions caused by the current indirect tax treatment. Brazil should reduce barriers to entry to the minimum possible by ensuring fair and non-discriminatory access to ducts, polls, and streamlining rights of way. We follow with interest that in line with this recommendation, Brazil is already recommending the antennas law, which eases infrastructure deployment of small cells and streamlines rights of way. For that, we applaud Brazil and the policymakers in Brasilia. To face the increased demand on communication networks inherent in the digital transformation, we need to not only deploy fiber backhaul deeper into the network, but also Brazil should closely monitor the effects of the recent regulatory reform on the successive renewal of spectrum licenses and its impact on market entry and competition in mobile markets. In addition, it should design the upcoming auction for 5G spectrum in a way that ensures a competitive market, particularly in light of new legislation enabling the successive renewal of spectrum licenses. To foster the Internet of Things, Brazil should eliminate taxes on the IoT, on the Internet of Things, such as the FISTEL, and establish a separate IoT numbering plan and re-examine outright IoT permanent roaming restrictions. Finally, government policies also play a key role in extending access to infrastructure. The successful deployment of networks needs to become a priority for the country. Brazil should coordinate entities across different levels of government to work together to implement broadband connectivity initiatives. Finally, Brazil should promote inclusive and forward-looking audiovisual public services while improving the data collection for broadcasting markets so as to better establish evidence-based policy making. Let me close with the main takeaways of the review. The first of which is bridging digital divides is a multi-dimensional challenge. The geographical features of the country create difficulties to bridge rural connectivity divides, and Brazil has a complex institutional framework requiring coordination at many levels of government. So, what to do for successful digital transformation? Improving digital skills, offering firms tax incentives to invest in digital technologies, particularly SMEs, small, medium enterprises, and increasingly funding for STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are all important to establish this foundation for the digital transformation coming. At the end of the day, reducing prices of communication services helps the poorest of households the most. We saw this in our work that started in 2012 in Mexico. To do that, reducing the tax burden on the communication sector and fostering competition are two key elements for lowering prices. Institutional frameworks play a critical role to expand connectivity and ensure successful digital transformation. Coordinating among different levels of government and an all-government approach for the digital transformation is needed. There is no digital transformation without a fiscal transformation. Establishing a converged regulator is key for Brazil's institutional framework. And the need to ensure the independence of the National Data Protection Authority. The appointment of its board of directors should be based on transparent and fair rules based on technical expertise. Finally, let me say that stepping up connectivity and digital transformation in Brazil would hasten the recovery from COVID-19 health emergency and inject much needed resilience in the economy and society. Thank you very much for your attention. And once again, thank you for inviting me to Painel Telebrasil 2021.
Em nome do presidente executivo da Conexis, Marcos Ferrari, eu agradeço a participação do diretor da OCDE, Andrew Wyckoff, que ofereceu aos participantes do painel Telebrasil uma visão moderna e atualizada dos efeitos da conectividade no desenvolvimento econômico e social dos países em crescimento. E muito obrigado também aos participantes que estiveram conosco até aqui. A agenda do painel Telebrasil 2021 ainda terá grandes atrações no período da tarde. Logo mais, às 14h, iniciamos o segundo bloco de keynotes setoriais, com a participação do Márcio Couto, professor da FGV, e do Ricardo Muti, presidente da Cisco do Brasil. Duas referências que irão aquecer o debate do segundo painel de hoje, a Agenda Digital para a Década, que começa às 14h30, não percam. E a partir das 16h, abriremos o segundo bloco de webinars do painel, que promete movimentar ainda mais nossa tarde com assuntos de grande interesse do setor de telecomunicações, autorregulação, RegTech e modernização regulatória, OperRAN, oportunidades e desafios, e ainda Internet das Coisas, cenário atual e perspectivas. Como sempre, a programação completa do evento e os detalhes da nossa agenda, incluindo os cursos sobre novas tecnologias patrocinados pela Huawei, você sabe, encontra aqui no site do painel telebrasil.org.br, que aparece aí na sua tela, né, Gustavo?
Excelente, Carla. Ainda temos aí muitas atividades no período da tarde. E agora, um momento de homenagem que a Telebrasil presta ao engenheiro e economista César Rômulo Silveira Neto. César Rômulo é parte da história da Telebrasil e do setor de telecomunicações. Como destacado profissional, sobretudo durante os 15 anos que se dedicou à Secretaria-Geral da Febratel, da Telebrasil, do Sind Telebrasil, hoje Conexis, e também da Contic, foi diretamente responsável pela articulação institucional de muitos posicionamentos setoriais, contribuindo para o aperfeiçoamento do ambiente regulatório do setor e seu protagonismo na agenda digital brasileira. César Rômulo nos deixou em julho deste ano, mas seu legado permanece também no painel Telebrasil e por muitos anos contou com sua inestimável capacidade de formulação e liderança. Como parte desta homenagem, a Telebrasil concedeu a César Rômulo Silveira Neto reconhecimento póstumo como sócio honorário da entidade, uma distinção aos personagens do presente e do passado que contribuem ou contribuíram significativamente para o desenvolvimento do setor de telecomunicações. Nossas homenagens também aos familiares, amigos e colegas de César Rômulo. O painel Telebrasil volta com vocês a partir das 14h.